The whine of the wind turbines was the constant soundtrack of Airless. Grayson adjusted the pressure gauges on the buoyancy regulator, the rhythmic hiss and click a familiar comfort against the ceaseless roar outside. From his vantage point high in the central spire, the city appeared a fragile cluster of metal and glass, clinging precariously to the swirling currents of Zephyr. He ran a hand through his close-cropped hair, the gesture a nervous tic he'd picked up since arriving on this wind-scoured world. Airless, jewel of humanity's expansion, a testament to their engineering prowess. Yet, it felt like a kite on a string, a child's toy at the mercy of a temperamental god. The Aethery. Zephyr's invisible inhabitants. They were the wind was them, a symbiotic dance Grayson was only beginning to understand. His job was to make sure Airless didn't become a broken kite, a casualty of that dance. Today, the wind felt different. Sharper. Edgier. It whispered secrets Grayson couldn't decipher, chilling him despite the regulated temperature of the spire. He checked the atmospheric readings again. Nothing conclusive. Just the usual erratic fluctuations Zephyr was known for. But he couldn't shake the feeling, the primal unease that settled deep in his gut. It reminded him of the day he lost his sister, a freak shuttle malfunction during Earth's orbital rush hour. The same sudden chill, the same premonition of disaster. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the data scrolling across his console. He had a job to do. He had to protect this city, protect the people who now called it home. But another part of him, a new, unsettling part, was drawn to the whispers on the wind. They weren't just atmospheric disturbances. They were voices, faint and elusive, yet somehow familiar. He'd glimpsed something in the swirling currents a few days ago. A shimmer, an iridescence against the pale Zephyr sky. Not a trick of the light, he was sure of it. An Aethery. He'd been studying their patterns for months, trying to understand their relationship with the wind, to translate their movements into something resembling language. It was a solitary pursuit, bordering on obsession. His colleagues thought he was wasting his time. Ghost chasing, they called it. But Grayson felt a pull, a connection to these unseen beings, unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Later that day, while calibrating the city's main buoyancy anchor, Grayson saw it again. The shimmer. It coalesced, forming a luminous cloud of particles, pulsing with an inner light. Xylo. He recognized her, though how he knew, he couldn't explain. She danced on the currents, a silent symphony of movement and light, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. He reached out a hand, instinctively, a foolish impulse he immediately regretted. His touch met only air, yet he felt a tingle, a faint electrical charge. A jolt that resonated not just in his hand, but deep within his soul. Xylo flowed around him, a caress of wind and light, then dispersed, vanishing back into the tumultuous Zephyr sky. He stood there, hand outstretched, the afterglow of her presence clinging to him like a second skin. He knew then, with sudden, startling clarity, that Zephyr was more than just a hostile planet to be conquered. It was a living being, and the Aethery were its voice. And he, Grayson, the engineer from Earth, haunted by loss and driven by a desperate need to understand, was somehow becoming a part of its song. The shimmer haunted him. He saw it in the flicker of the control panel lights, in the swirling dust motes of his quarters, in the restless currents of Zephyr itself. Xylo. The name echoed in his mind, a whisper on the wind. He devoured every scrap of information he could find about the Aethery, their symbiotic relationship with Zephyr, their almost ethereal existence. The city archives held scant details, mostly scientific observations and anthropological theories, devoid of any real understanding. It frustrated him. He needed to know her, not just her species. He found himself drawn to the observation deck, hoping for another glimpse. The wind howled, a relentless symphony of pressure and release, and he found solace in its chaotic energy. It mirrored the storm within him. His duty was to Airless, to its safety, to the human colony. But Xylo, she represented a different kind of responsibility, a pull towards the unknown, the unexplored. The memory of his sister, her laughter lost to the cold vacuum of space, resurfaced. He closed his eyes, the grief still sharp, yet tinged with a new, unexpected hope. Perhaps this alien world, this impossible connection, could offer him a kind of healing he hadn't dared to imagine. Then, he saw her. Xylo materialized from the swirling air currents, a radiant constellation of light against the dusk sky. He held his breath, afraid to break the spell. "You seek to understand," she whispered, her voice the rustle of wind chimes. He hesitated, then spoke, his words carried away by the gale. "I do. I need to. Humans, you are disruptive. A whirlwind in a delicate ecosystem." Her words held a hint of accusation, but also a flicker of curiosity. "We're learning. We want to coexist, not conquer," he pleaded, aware of how hollow his words might sound against the backdrop of the city's towering structures, a testament to human ambition. She drifted closer, and for the first time, he felt a tangible warmth against his skin, not just the chill of the wind. He reached out, his hand trembling, unsure if his touch would be welcome, if it might even harm her. His fingers brushed against her ethereal form, a sensation like static electricity mixed with the softest silk. He recoiled, but she remained, her light pulsing. "We do not understand your kind of connection," Xylo said, the shimmering particles that formed her swirling around him. "This touching. It is not how we commune." He lowered his hand, feeling a blush creep up his neck. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "It is new," she said, her voice a melodic sigh. "Intriguing." Over the next few days, their encounters became more frequent. Grayson learned that Xylo was part of a council of Air-3 elders, tasked with safeguarding Zephyr's delicate atmospheric balance. He also discovered that the intensifying wind patterns were not random. They were Zephyr's response to human activity, a warning. He tried to warn the city council, but they dismissed his concerns, their faith in their technology unwavering. Xylo's trust in him was a fragile thing, constantly tested by the actions of his own kind. He knew he had a choice to make. He could request a transfer back to Earth, escape this turbulent world and the impossible feelings Xylo stirred within him. Or he could stay, fight for a future where humans and Air-3 could coexist, a future that included Xylo. He knew what he had to do. He sent a message to Earth Command, withdrawing his transfer request. One day, during a tense meeting between human representatives and the Air-3 Council, a group of rogue human miners ignored warnings and activated a powerful drilling platform. Zephyr reacted violently. The wind intensified, threatening to tear Airless from its moorings. The Air-3 recoiled, fearing a deliberate attack. Xylo, seeing the genuine horror on Grayson's face, understood. This wasn't his doing. She took a risk, a gamble that could cost her her place within her community. She plunged into the heart of the storm, manipulating the wind currents to divert the worst of its fury from Airless, shielding the city at the expense of her own energy. He watched in awe and terror as she battled the storm, a beacon of shimmering light against the darkening sky. When she returned, her light dimmed, flickering like a dying ember. He rushed to her side, ignoring the stares of his colleagues and the wary whispers of the Air-3. He held her, his touch gentle, afraid to hurt her further, yet desperate to offer comfort. "Why?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Why risk so much?" "Because I believe in you, Grayson," she whispered, her voice fainter than the wind. "I believe in us." The wind howled a mournful song, a rising crescendo that vibrated through the metal bones of Airless. Grayson watched from the spire, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. The atmospheric readings were off the charts, the wind patterns chaotic, unpredictable. He'd tried to warn the city council, presented his research, the data he'd painstakingly collected on the Air-3 and their connection to Zephyr's atmosphere. They'd patted him on the back, praised his enthusiasm, and assured him their buoyancy technology could handle anything Zephyr threw at them. Their arrogance, their unshakable faith in human engineering, both infuriated and terrified him. He saw a shimmer at the edge of his vision, a familiar iridescence against the darkening sky. "Xylo!" She coalesced beside him, her form flickering with concern. "The storm, it grows," she whispered, her voice the rustle of dry leaves. "I know," he said, his gaze fixed on the swirling clouds gathering around the city. They won't listen. They think they can control Zephyr, bend it to their will. Control is an illusion, Grayson, Xylo murmured, her particles swirling around him like a worried embrace. Zephyr cannot be controlled, only understood. I understand, he replied, meeting her ethereal gaze. But how do I make them see? A flicker of doubt crossed her shimmering form. My people, they do not trust humans. Your technology, it disrupts the balance. Not all of us, he said, reaching out a hand, his touch hesitant. I want to learn. I want to help. His fingers brushed against her, a sensation unlike anything he'd ever experienced. A tingle of energy, a rush of warmth that spread through his arm, chasing away the chill of the wind. He pulled back slightly, afraid he'd hurt her, his touch too coarse for her ethereal form. Xylo's light pulsed. This touch, she whispered. It is strange. But not unpleasant. A blush crept up Grayson's neck. He hadn't meant to touch her, not like that. It was an impulse, a need to connect, to reassure her, and perhaps, to reassure himself. I'm sorry, he stammered, suddenly acutely aware of the vast difference between them, the chasm of culture and biology that separated them. Do not apologize, Xylo said, drifting closer. It is new. We learn. Over the next few days, the storm continued to build, the wind screaming through the city's canyons, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. Grayson worked tirelessly, trying to find a solution, a way to mitigate the damage, to prove to the council, to himself, that he could protect this fragile home he'd come to care for. But deep down, he knew it was more than just duty. It was about Xylo, about the fragile trust they'd built, about the hope of a future together, a future he hadn't dared to imagine until she entered his life. The memory of his sister's face, frozen in fear as the shuttle disintegrated, resurfaced. He closed his eyes, the grief a familiar ache, but now, it was accompanied by a flicker of something else, a warmth that spread through his chest. Xylo! She was his new beginning, his reason to hope. Then, the unthinkable happened. During a tense meeting between human representatives and the Aethery Council, a group of rogue miners, driven by greed and a disregard for Zephyr's delicate ecosystem, activated a powerful drilling platform in a restricted zone. The planet reacted violently. The storm, already brewing, erupted into a frenzy. The Aethery, interpreting the action as a deliberate attack, recoiled in fear and anger. Chaos erupted in the meeting chamber. Xylo saw the look of horror on Grayson's face. She understood. This wasn't his doing. She knew she had to act, to prove to her people, to Grayson, that not all humans were the same. She made a choice, a dangerous gamble that could cost her her place among her kind. She plunged into the heart of the storm, using her connection to Zephyr's atmosphere to divert the worst of its fury away from Airless, shielding the city at the expense of her own energy. Grayson watched, his heart pounding in his chest, as she battled the raging wind, a shimmering beacon of courage against the darkening sky. When she returned, her light was dim, flickering like a dying ember. He rushed to her side, ignoring the stares of his colleagues, the hushed whispers of the Aethery. He reached out, his touch gentle, afraid to hurt her, but desperate to offer comfort. Why? He whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. Why risk so much? Because, she whispered back, her voice barely audible above the wind's roar, I believe in you, Grayson. I believe in us. The wind whispered secrets through the skeletal frame of Airless, secrets Grayson felt resonating in his bones. He sat hunched over his workbench, surrounded by a chaotic symphony of wires, transducers, and resonators. He was building a bridge, not of steel and cable, but of sound and vibration, a way to speak to the wind, to speak to Xylo. He knew it was a long shot, a crazy idea born of desperation and a growing, undeniable love for a being of air and light. He'd studied the Aethery's patterns, the way they manipulated the currents, the subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure that preceded their whispers. He believed they communicated through vibrations, a language woven into the very fabric of Zephyr's atmosphere. He glanced at the small, iridescent feather resting on his workbench, a gift from Xylo. It shimmered with captured sunlight, a tangible reminder of her ethereal presence. He'd confessed to her about his sister, lost in the cold void of space. The grief, usually a sharp, debilitating pain, felt dulled in Xylo's presence, replaced by a strange, unfamiliar hope. Xylo, in her own way, had confessed too. She carried the burden of her people's fear and distrust of humans, the weight of their ancient traditions, the pressure to protect Zephyr's delicate balance. Their connection, this fragile bridge between two worlds, was a risk for both of them. "This is unusual," Xylo whispered, her form coalescing beside him, a shimmer of light and color against the dull metal of his workbench. "You seek to speak our language?" Grayson looked up, his heart skipping a beat at her closeness. "Not exactly speak," he said, his voice a little shaky. "More like, listen. And maybe, whisper back." He held up the device, a delicate latticework of resonating wires, powered by a small, pulsating crystal. I hope, it might allow us to communicate more clearly." Xylo drifted closer, her light pulsing with curiosity. "Intriguing," she murmured, her voice a gentle sigh of wind. She reached out a shimmering tendril, tentatively touching the device. A faint hum filled the air, a melodic vibration that resonated deep within Grayson's chest. He adjusted the frequency, mimicking the patterns he'd observed in the Aethery's movements. The hum intensified, morphing into a series of distinct pulses. Xylo's light flickered, her form shifting and swirling in response to the changing vibrations. We're here," he whispered, barely daring to breathe. A wave of warmth washed over him, a sensation he now recognized as Xylo's touch, her way of communicating affection, understanding. "Yes," she whispered, her voice clearer, stronger than he'd ever heard it. "I hear." Over the next few days, they practiced, learning to translate thoughts and feelings into vibrations, building a bridge of shared understanding. Grayson learned about Xylo's hopes for her people, her desire to prove that humans and Aethery could be allies, not adversaries. He confessed his growing love for her, his words a trembling symphony of vibrations. Xylo's response was a gentle caress of warmth, a silent acknowledgement of a connection that defied logic and species. He made a choice that sealed his fate on Zephyr. He withdrew his transfer request to Earth, severing his last tie to the world he once called home. He belonged here now, with Xylo, with the wind, with the future they were building together. Then, during a tense meeting between human representatives and the Aethery Council, disaster struck. A group of rogue miners, driven by greed, ignored warnings and activated a powerful drilling platform in a restricted zone. Zephyr reacted violently. The wind intensified, a furious crescendo that threatened to tear Airless from its moorings. The Aethery, interpreting the action as a deliberate attack, recoiled in fear and anger. Xylo saw the look of horror on Grayson's face. She knew this wasn't his doing. She had to act, to prove to her people, to Grayson, that not all humans were the same. She plunged into the heart of the storm, manipulating the wind currents to divert the worst of its fury away from Airless, shielding the city at the expense of her own energy. Grayson watched, his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of awe and terror. He knew she was risking her life, not just for the city, but for him. When she returned, her light was dim, flickering like a dying ember. He rushed to her side, his touch gentle, afraid to hurt her further, yet desperate to offer comfort. "Why?" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Why risk so much?" "Because," she whispered back, her voice a faint echo in the howling wind, "I believe in you, Grayson. I believe in us." The storm hit Airless like a celestial hammer. The city groaned, its intricate web of cables and anchors straining against the relentless onslaught of wind. The rhythmic hum of the buoyancy engines, usually a source of comfort, now rose to a frantic shriek, a desperate plea against the overwhelming force. Panic gripped the city. Alarms blared, their insistent wail swallowed by the wind's roar. Grayson gripped the railing of the observation deck, his knuckles white, his stomach churning. He could feel the city tilting, its precarious balance threatened. He'd warned them, pleaded with the council, but their faith in human ingenuity had been unshakable, their arrogance a blinding veil. Xylo materialized beside him, her shimmering form flickering anxiously. "It is as I feared," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "Zephyr rejects your intrusion." He reached for her, needing to feel her presence, her strange, comforting warmth amidst the chaos. His fingers brushed against her ethereal form, a tingle of energy passing between them. He hesitated, remembering her earlier words about human touch, but she didn't recoil. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her light pulsing. "It is not your fault, Grayson," she murmured, sensing his guilt, his despair. "Not entirely." "But the miners?" He began, his voice thick with frustration. "Their greed, their disregard for—" "They are not all of you," Xylo said, her voice surprisingly firm. "I see that now. I see you." He closed his eyes, the city's fate, his own fate, Xylo's fate, all swirling in his mind like the storm raging outside. He saw his sister's face, her laughter echoing across the years, lost forever in the cold vacuum of space. He'd come to Zephyr seeking escape, a new beginning, and he'd found it, in the most unexpected of places, in the heart of a storm, in the ethereal embrace of an alien being. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Xylo's shimmering form. He had a choice to make. He could try to escape, to save himself, abandon this city, this alien world, this impossible love. Or he could stay, fight for a future he wasn't sure was even possible, a future with Xylo. "There might be a way," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "A way to stabilize the city, to appease Zephyr." Xylo's light flickered with hope. "Tell me." He explained his plan, a desperate gamble that combined human technology with the Aetheri's intimate knowledge of Zephyr's atmospheric currents. It was a long shot, but it was their only hope. He saw doubt in Xylo's shimmering form. "My people, they are afraid. They will not trust you." "They will trust you," Grayson said, his gaze unwavering. "You must convince them. Tell them I'm not like the others. Tell them, I love Zephyr, I love you." Xylo's light pulsed, a wave of warmth washing over him. "This love," she whispered. "It is a powerful current." She drifted away, her form dissolving into the wind, her voice echoing in his mind. "I will try, Grayson. For you. For us." He watched her go, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of the city, the weight of their future, resting on her shimmering shoulders. He knew she was risking everything, not just her life, but her place among her people, for him. He turned and ran, towards the command center, towards his destiny, towards the storm. He had a city to save, a love to protect, a future to build, brick by fragile brick, amidst the chaos. The wind shrieked a symphony of chaos around Airless, the very air vibrating with Zephyr's fury. Grayson ran, his boots thudding against the metal grating of the connecting walkway between two habitation spheres, the structure swaying precariously in the gale. He had to reach the central control spire, had to implement their desperate plan. He'd convinced Xylo it was their only hope, a precarious dance between human technology and Aetheri understanding, but the Council had been resistant, their fear palpable. It was only Xylo's impassioned plea, her unwavering belief in him, that had swayed them. He gripped the small, iridescent feather she'd given him, its delicate structure miraculously intact despite the raging storm. It was a physical anchor to her, a reminder of the fragile hope they shared. He stumbled, the walkway lurching beneath his feet, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he was going to be swept away into the maelstrom. Then, a sudden gust of wind, strangely controlled, steadied him. He looked up and saw a shimmer in the swirling air currents, Xylo's form flickering like a distressed flame. "Grayson!" Her voice, amplified by the wind, was a desperate cry. "The Council, they've changed their minds. They believe the humans will retaliate. They're withdrawing their support." His heart sank. Without the Aetheri's help, their plan was doomed. He reached out to her, his hand instinctively stretching towards her shimmering form, an impossible longing to connect, to comfort. "Xylo, wait!" She retreated, her light dimming. I cannot, she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and regret. My duty is to my people. Your duty is to Zephyr, he shouted, his voice barely audible above the wind's roar. We can still save the city, save us. He saw the flicker of doubt in her light, the internal conflict mirroring his own. He was torn between his responsibility to the human colony and his burgeoning love for this alien being, this creature of air and light who'd captured his heart in ways he never thought possible. He'd already made one choice, a choice that irrevocably bound him to Zephyr, to Xylo. He'd withdrawn his transfer request to Earth, abandoned his dream of returning home, of finding peace after the crushing grief of losing his sister. Xylo was his new beginning, his new home, his reason to hope. Xylo's light pulsed, a wave of warmth washing over him, a silent communication of understanding, of shared despair. Then, she did something extraordinary, something that stole his breath away. She turned and flew directly towards the heart of the storm, a shimmering arrow against the raging wind. He knew instantly what she intended to do. She was going to confront the rogue miners herself, to reason with them, to stop their reckless drilling, to prove to her people, to him, that not all humans were destroyers. It was a reckless act, a desperate gamble that could cost her her life. He watched her disappear into the swirling clouds, his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of fear and awe. He had to reach the control spire, had to activate the stabilization system, had to trust that Xylo could buy him the time he needed. He ran, driven by adrenaline and a desperate hope, his boots pounding a rhythm against the swaying metal, a counterpoint to the wind's chaotic symphony. He reached the spire, his lungs burning, his body trembling with exhaustion. He slammed his hand against the activation panel, the system whirring to life, the city's anchors groaning as they adjusted to the shifting currents. He could feel the city stabilizing, slowly, precariously. But it wasn't enough. He needed Xylo. He needed Zephyr. He stumbled to the observation deck, peering into the storm, searching for a shimmer of light, a sign of hope. And then, he saw it. A faint, flickering iridescence against the darkening sky. Xylo! She was returning, her light dim, battered, but alive. He rushed towards her, his heart soaring with relief. He reached out, his touch gentle, reverent. This time, she didn't retreat. She flowed into his embrace, her ethereal form wrapping around him like a silken shroud, her warmth a beacon against the storm's chill. He could feel the tremor in her light, the exhaustion, the fear. He held her close, whispering words of comfort, of love, into the wind. You did it, Xylo, he murmured against her shimmering form. You saved us. We saved us, Grayson, she whispered back, her voice a faint sigh against his skin. Together. The wind roared, a physical force that battered airless, threatening to rip the city from its moorings. Grayson clung to the railing of the observation platform, his stomach twisting with a sickening blend of fear and regret. Below, the city was a maelstrom of flashing lights and panicked shouts. The buoyancy engine strained, their rhythmic hum now a desperate shriek. He looked towards the churning clouds, searching for a flicker of iridescence, a sign of Xylo. He had to believe she had reached the miners, had to believe she could convince them to stop. Then, the platform shuddered violently. A sickening groan of metal echoed through the structure. He felt a hand on his arm, cool and strangely comforting. Xylo! She materialized beside him, her light flickering weakly, her shimmering form battered by the storm. Grayson, she whispered, her voice strained. They wouldn't listen. They attacked me. A surge of fury, protectiveness, roared through him, momentarily eclipsing his fear. Attacked you, he repeated, his voice raw. He reached out, his hand hovering over her shimmering form, hesitant to touch, afraid of causing further harm. She leaned into his touch, her light pulsing. It is nothing, she whispered. Zephyr is angry. The storm, it grows. He knew what he had to do. He had to activate the emergency stabilization system, the one he designed, the one the Council had dismissed as unnecessary. It was a risky maneuver, a last-ditch effort to harmonize the city's buoyancy with the chaotic wind currents. It would require all his focus, all his skill. "I have to go," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "I have to stabilize the city." He saw fear flicker in her light. "Grayson, wait! It is too dangerous." "The storm." He cupped her ethereal face in his hands, a gesture both tender and desperate. He felt a jolt, a strange energy passing between them, a connection that transcended words, species, worlds. "I have to try," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "For you. For us." He turned and ran towards the control room, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached the console, his hands flying over the controls, activating the stabilization sequence. The city groaned, its metal frame protesting under the strain. He could feel the storm's fury intensifying, pushing against the city, testing its limits. Then, the unthinkable happened. An alarm blared, a piercing shriek that cut through the wind's roar. A critical system failure. He knew instantly what it meant. The main buoyancy anchor, the one closest to the rogue miners, was buckling under the strain. If it gave way, the city would be ripped apart. He had a choice to make. He could continue with the stabilization sequence, risking his own life, risking Xylo's life, in a desperate attempt to save the city. Or he could reroute power to the failing anchor, stabilizing that section, but sacrificing the other sections, condemning hundreds, perhaps thousands, to be swept away by the storm. He closed his eyes, seeing his sister's face, the fear in her eyes as the shuttle disintegrated around her. He'd come to Zephyr to escape that grief, to find a new beginning. He'd found it, in the shimmering form of an alien being, in the heart of a storm, in a love that defied logic and species. He couldn't lose her. Not again. He rerouted the power, his hands trembling, his heart aching with the weight of his decision. He'd chosen to save Xylo, to save a part of the city, at the cost of the rest. He'd chosen love over duty. He'd chosen hope over despair. He stumbled towards the observation platform, his legs weak, his body numb. He had to see her, had to know she was safe. And then, he saw her. She was standing at the edge of the platform, her light brighter than he'd ever seen it before, a beacon against the raging storm. The wind swirled around her, obeying her command, calming, soothing, protecting. She'd done it. She'd stopped the miners. She'd saved them all. She turned towards him, her light pulsing, a wave of warmth washing over him. He reached out, his hand trembling, and this time, she didn't hesitate. She took his hand, her touch cool and firm, a silent promise. The storm raged on, but within their shared embrace, there was a stillness, a quiet refuge, a shared hope for a future they would build together, brick by fragile brick, amidst the ruins. The storm had subsided, leaving Airless battered but unbroken. A fragile, eerie calm settled over the city, the silence punctuated by the creak of stressed metal and the distant cries of the injured. Grayson stood on the observation deck, the wind whipping his hair around his face, carrying the scent of ozone and a faint, metallic tang. The city below was a patchwork of damage, a testament to Zephyr's fury and Xylo's courage. He'd seen her, a shimmering beacon against the raging storm, diverting the worst of the wind's fury, shielding the city at the expense of her own energy. He'd made a choice, a terrible choice, sacrificing a section of the city to save her, to save the main buoyancy anchor. Hundreds had been lost, swept away by the storm. The weight of that decision pressed down on him, a heavy cloak of guilt. He saw a shimmer at the edge of his vision. Xylo materialized beside him, her light dimmed, flickering like a dying ember. He reached for her, his touch hesitant, afraid he might somehow hurt her further. She didn't recoil. Instead, she flowed into his embrace, her ethereal form wrapping around him, her warmth a solace against the chill wind and the colder fear that gripped his heart. I lost people, he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. Because of me. You saved many more, Grayson, Xylo murmured against his skin, her voice a gentle sigh. And you saved me. He closed his eyes, the memory of his sister's face, frozen in fear, flashing through his mind. He'd come to Zephyr seeking escape, a new beginning. He'd found it, in the most unexpected of places, in the heart of a storm, in the shimmering embrace of an alien being. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Xylo's ethereal light. "I'm not going back," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. He'd withdrawn his transfer request, severed his last tie to Earth. He belonged here now, with her, with Zephyr, with the future they would build together, however uncertain it might be. Xylo's light pulsed, a wave of warmth washing over him. "This, staying," she whispered, her voice a melodic sigh. "It is good." She drifted closer, her shimmering form brushing against his, a sensation that sent a shiver down his spine. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to kiss her, to bridge the gap between their species, their worlds, with a gesture as old as time itself. He hesitated, unsure if such a thing was even possible, if his touch would harm her, if such a gesture would even have meaning for her. He saw a flicker of understanding in her light. She tilted her ethereal head, a shimmering particle swirling around his face like a curious caress. "This is a desire," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "It is new. Intriguing." He leaned in, his heart pounding in his chest, and gently brushed his lips against her shimmering form. It felt like kissing the wind, a fleeting touch of cool air and a faint electrical tingle. He pulled back slightly, his breath catching in his throat. Xylo's light pulsed, a wave of warmth radiating outwards, a silent acknowledgement of a connection that defied logic and species. The days that followed were a blur of activity. The city council, humbled by the near disaster, finally acknowledged the need for a more sustainable approach to Zephyr. Grayson, with Xylo's help, began working on new technologies, designs that harmonized with the planet's wind currents rather than fighting against them. He worked alongside Aethery engineers, bridging the gap between human ingenuity and their innate understanding of Zephyr's delicate ecosystem. Their connection deepened, their love a quiet refuge amidst the ongoing chaos of rebuilding. They learned to communicate, not just through words and vibrations, but through touch, through shared silences, through the silent language of shared purpose. Yet, their union wasn't without its challenges. Some humans, still clinging to old prejudices, viewed his relationship with Xylo with suspicion, even hostility. And among the Aethery, there were whispers, doubts about Xylo's loyalty, her growing attachment to a human. One day, during a tense negotiation between the city council and the Aethery elders, a group of human extremists, fearing the loss of their mining operations, launched a surprise attack on an Aethery gathering. Chaos erupted. Accusations flew. The fragile peace they'd built teetered on the brink of collapse. Xylo turned to Grayson, her light flickering with fear and determination. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising clamor. "I have to stop them." "It's too dangerous," he pleaded, his hand reaching out to her. They'll listen to me," she said, her voice firm. "I have to try. For you. For us." He watched her disappear into the swirling currents, his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of fear and admiration. She was risking everything, not just her life, but her place among her people, to prove that humans and Aethery could coexist, that their love wasn't a betrayal, but a bridge. He knew he couldn't stand idly by. He turned and faced the human council, his voice ringing with authority. "This has to stop," he shouted, his words echoing through the chamber. "We have to choose. War or peace. Destruction or coexistence. Which will it be?" The future remained uncertain, a delicate balance between hope and fear. Their love, once a quiet refuge, now stood exposed, a symbol of a new beginning, a fragile bridge between two worlds. Whether that bridge would hold, whether their love could withstand the storms to come, remained to be seen. But as Grayson stood on the observation deck, watching the wind whisper through the rebuilt city, he knew one thing for sure. He was home. The reconstruction efforts continued at a feverish pace, but a sense of unease still hung heavy in the air, clinging to Ellis like the lingering scent of ozone after a storm. The damaged sections of the city were a stark reminder of the near disaster, a testament to the fragility of their existence on Zephyr. The council, humbled by their near destruction, had finally agreed to work with the Aethery, acknowledging the need for a more harmonious approach to their shared home. Yet, suspicion and resentment simmered beneath the surface, both among humans and Aethery. Grayson's relationship with Xylo, once a symbol of hope, was now a focal point of that tension, a lightning rod for the anxieties of both cultures. Grayson and Xylo found themselves walking a precarious tightrope. They worked tirelessly, side by side, designing new energy systems that harnessed Zephyr's wind currents without disrupting the delicate atmospheric balance. He'd come to rely on her insights, her intuitive understanding of the wind's whispers. Their shared purpose had woven a bond between them, a quiet strength that defied the growing hostility from those who couldn't comprehend their connection. He often thought of his sister, lost in the cold emptiness of space. The grief, once a crushing weight, now felt like a distant echo, replaced by a warmth that radiated from Xylo, a sense of belonging he'd never expected to find on this alien world. He'd chosen this life, this love, this uncertain future, over the familiar comforts of Earth. He'd made peace with his choice, even though the ghosts of the past still haunted him. Xylo, too, carried her own burdens. She'd risked her standing within her community by championing his cause, by believing in the possibility of human-Aethery cooperation. She confided in him, her voice a whisper of wind chimes, about the ancient prophecies of her people, the warnings against interfering with Zephyr's delicate balance. He held her close, his touch gentle, a silent reassurance that he wouldn't betray her trust, wouldn't betray their shared dream. One evening, as they worked late in the newly established joint engineering lab, their hands brushed. He felt a jolt, a familiar tingle of energy passing between them. He looked up, his gaze meeting her shimmering light. He saw a flicker of something in her depths, something that mirrored his own longing. He leaned in, his heart pounding in his chest, and gently kissed her. It was like kissing the wind, a fleeting touch of cool air and a spark of energy that resonated deep within his soul. He pulled back slightly, his breath catching in his throat. Xylo's light pulsed, a wave of warmth radiating outwards, a silent affirmation. Their intimate moments were a refuge, a quiet space amidst the chaos of rebuilding. Yet, even in their shared solitude, the shadows of their respective cultures loomed. He learned that Aethery expressions of affection were subtle, nuanced, a language of shared energy and subtle shifts in the wind's currents. He had to be patient, had to unlearn human notions of intimacy, had to learn to listen to the wind, to feel her presence in the gentle caress of a breeze, in the warmth of the sun on his skin. Then, during a tense negotiation between the city council and the Aethery elders, disaster struck. A group of human extremists, fearing the loss of their mining operations, launched a surprise attack on an Aethery gathering, misinterpreting a peaceful ritual as a hostile act. Chaos erupted, accusations flew, the fragile peace shattered like thin ice. Xylo turned to Grayson, her light flickering with fear and determination. "I have to go," she whispered. "I have to stop them." "It's too dangerous," he pleaded, his heart clenching with fear. "They'll listen to me," she said, her voice firm. "I have to try." He watched her disappear into the swirling currents, knowing she was risking everything to bridge the widening chasm between their worlds. He knew he couldn't stand idly by. He turned and faced the human council, his voice ringing with authority. "This has to stop. We have to choose. War or peace." In the aftermath of the attack, Grayson and Xylo found themselves ostracized by both their communities. Their love, once a symbol of hope, was now viewed as a betrayal by those who clung to old prejudices. They stood together, hand in hand, a solitary beacon against the storm of disapproval. The future remained uncertain, a delicate balance between hope and despair. Yet, as they stood on the observation deck, watching the wind whisper through the rebuilt city, they knew they weren't alone. Their love, fragile yet resilient, was a seed of change, a testament to the power of connection, a whisper of hope for a future where humans and Aethery could truly coexist, not as adversaries, but as allies, bound by a shared destiny on the windswept world of Zephyr.